It was the kind of afternoon that barely registers in memory. Late spring in rural Tennessee, 1995. Warm, but not oppressive. Quiet enough that the hum of insects and the occasional passing car felt louder than usual. The Lehman home sat back from the road, modest and familiar, surrounded by a yard that had held years of ordinary family life. Nothing about that day suggested it would become a marker in time, split cleanly into before and after. 6-year-old Annie Lehman was in the backyard. She had been there countless times before. The fence was old but intact, enclosing a patch of grass worn thin by footsteps and play. A few toys were scattered near the porch. Annie's shoes sat close to the back steps, kicked off the way children do when they move from indoors to outdoors, without thinking twice. She had been playing quietly, within sight of the kitchen window, close enough that her presence didn't demand constant attention. Inside the house, life moved in small, unremarkable motions. Someone rinsed dishes. Someone else walked from room to room. The back door opened and closed more than once, letting in warm air and the smell of cut grass. Each time, Annie was still there. Small. Safe. Exactly where she was supposed to be. At some point, no one could later say exactly when, the rhythm broke. It wasn't a scream or a crash that triggered alarm. It was absence. A glance out the window that lasted a fraction too long. The yard looked the same, but Annie wasn't in it. No movement near the fence. No small figure crouched behind a tree or bent over a toy. Just empty grass and stillness. At first, it didn't feel dangerous. Children wander. They hide. They get quiet. Someone called her name casually, expecting a laugh or a response from behind the shed or around the corner of the house. When there was no answer, the calling grew louder, sharper. Doors opened. Footsteps moved quickly across the yard. Annie wasn't by the fence. She wasn't behind the porch. She wasn't crouched in the narrow spaces adults forget to check at first. Her shoes were still there, untouched. That detail didn't register immediately. It sat in the background, waiting. Within minutes, the tone shifted. The backyard was no longer a place of play. It became a search zone. Family members split up, checking the side yard, the driveway, the front of the house. Her name echoed, carried by voices that were already tightening with fear. Neighbors were called out of their homes, drawn by urgency they could hear even before they understood it. People began to fan out instinctively, through nearby yards, along fence lines, toward the thin tree line at the edge of the property. Someone checked behind outbuildings. Someone else ran down the road, scanning ditches and culverts. Time moved strangely, compressing and stretching all at once. Every minute felt longer than it should have, yet impossible to track. Someone dialed 911. The call was frantic but controlled enough to be understood. A child, 6 years old, missing from the backyard, just moments ago. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. What was she wearing? When was she last seen? Was there anyone suspicious nearby? The answers came quickly, then slowed as uncertainty crept in. No one had seen a stranger. No unfamiliar car had been noticed. There had been no noise, no struggle, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Sheriff's deputies arrived quickly, lights flashing but sirens off. At first, their posture was calm, procedural. Children wander. Children hide. Children get distracted and walk farther than expected. It happens. They asked questions, retraced steps, scanned the immediate area. One deputy crouched to Annie's height, looking for signs a child might leave behind without realizing it. They expected to find her close. They expected footprints in the soft dirt near the fence, leading outward or looping back toward the house. They expected a bent section of fencing or a gate left ajar. They expected something small and simple that would explain the fear away. But the gate was closed, latched, undisturbed. Deputies expanded the search radius slowly, methodically. More neighbors joined in, drawn by word of mouth and the growing cluster of vehicles near the Lehman home. Someone brought flashlights as the light began to soften toward evening. The air cooled slightly, and with it came a new kind of tension. Not panic yet, but something heavier, something that sat in the chest and refused to move. Annie's name was called again and again, each time with more desperation. No response came back, no rustle in the trees, no cry, no sign. A deputy noticed the shoes by the back steps and paused. Asked when Annie had last been seen wearing them. The answer was immediate. She hadn't been. She'd taken them off before going outside. That detail shifted something subtle, but important. Children who wander usually don't leave without shoes. They don't walk far barefoot unless they intend to stay close. Searchers moved farther out, combing through brush, checking under porches, peering into drainage pipes. The logic was still hopeful. She could have slipped. She could be scared and quiet. She could be right there, just out of sight. But the yard told a different story. There were no scuffed paths, no broken branches, no disturbed patches of ground. The earth held its shape too well. As daylight began to fade, law enforcement adjusted their tone. Radios crackled. Additional units were requested. The assumption of a short-range disappearance started to weaken, replaced by a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If Annie hadn't wandered off, then where was she? Neighbors whispered theories in low voices. A passing car, a stranger, someone who had been watching. Others shook their heads, unwilling to say it. This was a quiet place. People knew each other. Nothing like this happened here. A deputy walked the fence line again, slower this time. Checked the latch, tested the boards. It held. Solid, unbroken. There was no obvious way for a 6-year-old to leave the yard unnoticed, and no obvious way for someone else to enter without leaving a trace. Darkness crept in, not suddenly, but inevitably. The searchlights came out. Shadows stretched across the grass, distorting familiar shapes into unfamiliar ones. The backyard no longer felt safe or ordinary. It felt exposed. The realization settled unevenly among those gathered there. This was not a case of a child wandering too far. This was not hide-and-seek gone wrong. Annie Lehman had been present one moment and gone the next, without sound, without evidence, without explanation. Someone said it quietly first, almost as a question. Then others began to accept it, one by one. She hadn't wandered off. She had vanished. And as the night deepened over the Lehman property, with searchers still calling her name into the dark, the understanding took hold that whatever had happened to Annie had happened quickly, silently, and close to home. The yard that had felt so safe just hours earlier now held a terrifying certainty. Something had taken her from a place where nothing ever happened, and left behind only silence, unanswered questions, and a fear that would not loosen its grip. By morning, the quiet fear that had settled over the Lehman property hardened into something more organized, more serious. Overnight, the assumption that Annie might simply wander back had faded. Law enforcement no longer spoke in the soft, reassuring tones reserved for temporary disappearances. By sunrise, the language shifted. This was no longer just a missing child. This was a possible abduction. Additional deputies arrived, followed by state investigators. The yard that had been searched in panic the night before was now examined with intention. Measurements were taken. Notes were written. The fence line was documented inch by inch. The ground was studied for disturbances that might have been missed in the dark. Nothing stood out. It was as if Annie had never been there at all. Search efforts expanded rapidly. Volunteer fire departments from neighboring towns arrived with equipment and manpower. Organized search teams formed grids that pushed outward from the Lehman home, moving through wooded areas, fields, and narrow dirt paths that connected properties. Creek beds were waded through slowly, water cold around boots, eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong. Abandoned sheds were unlocked and inspected. Old wells, some long forgotten, were marked and checked one by one. K-9 units were brought in early that morning. Handlers worked carefully, conscious of how easily a scene could be contaminated after so many people had already moved through it. The dogs were given Annie's scent from clothing she had worn recently. At first, there was a sense of cautious optimism. The dogs moved with purpose, noses low, pulling gently at their leads. But the trail didn't last. Near the fence line, close to where Annie had been playing, the dogs slowed. Their behavior changed. They circled briefly, then stopped. Handlers tried again, redirecting them, hoping the scent had drifted or been confused. The result was the same. Annie's trail didn't lead into the woods. It didn't follow the road. It simply ended. To experienced investigators, that detail carried weight. When a child wanders, scent trails usually extend outward in uneven patterns, stopping and starting as the child pauses or changes direction. When a child is carried, the trail often stops abruptly. This one stopped at the edge of the yard, above the search area. A helicopter began slow passes, its presence both reassuring and unsettling. From the air, the land looked deceptively simple. Open fields, tree clusters, narrow waterways. Nothing that clearly explained how a child could disappear without being seen. Searchers on the ground moved again through areas already checked, driven by the fear that something small had been overlooked. Meanwhile, investigators turned their focus inward, toward the people who had been present that day. Family members were interviewed separately, then again, asked to recount the afternoon minute by minute. Who was where? Who went inside? Who stepped out? What sounds were heard? What wasn't? The timeline was reconstructed with precision. Annie had been seen playing quietly. No one recalled hearing a car slow down. No doors slammed. No raised voices. The house had not been empty. The backyard had not been unattended for long enough to explain what had happened. Still, questions pressed in. Investigators asked about visitors, arguments, anything unusual in the days leading up to the disappearance. The answers were consistent. Ordinary, almost painfully so. No ransom call came. As hours turned into days, that absence became another troubling detail. If this had been an abduction for money, someone would have reached out. If it had been a stranger passing through, there might have been a vehicle reported, a sighting, something tangible to follow. There was nothing. Tips began to pour in anyway. Some were well-meaning. Others were driven by fear, imagination, or a desire to be involved in something that had already gripped the community. Sightings were reported miles away, then retracted. Someone thought they saw a child matching Annie's description at a gas station. Another claimed to have seen her near a highway. Each lead was followed carefully, and each one collapsed under scrutiny. Psychics inserted themselves into the search, calling law enforcement and local media with claims of visions and impressions. They pointed to rivers, barns, specific coordinates that led nowhere. Investigators listened politely, but resources were limited, and the information offered no verifiable details. Still, each claim reignited hope for a moment, and each dead end made the eventual silence heavier. Media attention intensified. News vans parked near the Lehman home. Reporters asked the same questions again and again. How could a child disappear from her own backyard? Who could have taken her? Was anyone being investigated? The family's grief became public, their private moments framed by cameras and speculation. The community began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. Some believed firmly in an outsider abduction, a drifter, a passing vehicle, someone who knew how to move quickly and quietly. Others, more cautiously, began to wonder if the answers were closer to home, not because of evidence, but because there was nothing else to explain what had happened. That shift was subtle, but it mattered. Conversations changed tone. Neighbors who had searched side by side now avoided eye contact. Rumors circulated quietly, never spoken directly, but felt. Trust thinned. Investigators continued to work methodically. They reviewed sex offender registries. They examined known offenders in the region. They coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions. Roadblocks were set up briefly, then removed when no useful information emerged. Flyers went up. Annie's face became familiar far beyond the small Tennessee town where she had lived. Days turned into weeks. Search operations were scaled back, then paused, then restarted in targeted ways. Each time, the outcome was the same. No physical evidence, no confirmed sightings, no clear suspects. The land gave up nothing. The case resisted every angle applied to it. Behind closed doors, law enforcement began to confront the reality they had been avoiding. Without evidence, without witnesses, without a trail to follow, there was nothing left to actively pursue. The investigation didn't end. It couldn't. But it slowed, settling into the uneasy category of cases that remain open in name, but frozen in progress. The official language reflected that shift. No physical evidence, no suspects, no direction forward. Within weeks, Annie Lehman's disappearance was classified as a cold case. The search that had begun with urgency and hope ended not with answers, but with absence. And as the town returned, outwardly, to normal routines, something fundamental had changed. A child was gone, and no one could explain how or why. The silence left behind wasn't just the absence of Annie's voice. It was the growing realization that whatever truth lay beneath her disappearance was buried deep, waiting, and not ready to surface. Time did not soften the questions surrounding Annie Lehman's disappearance. Instead, it rearranged them. As months turned into years, the urgency that once drove search teams through fields and creek beds was replaced by something quieter and more uncomfortable. Investigators who remained on the case began to look not outward, but inward. Not because they wanted to place blame, but because experience told them that when a child vanishes without witnesses or evidence, the truth often exists within the smallest circle. This shift was never announced publicly. There were no accusations, no press statements hinting at suspicion. It happened behind closed doors, in case files pulled from shelves and reopened late at night. Detectives revisited interviews given in the first frantic days after Annie disappeared. They listened again to recorded statements, reading them alongside handwritten notes. paying attention not just to what was said, but how it was said. Small inconsistencies surfaced. Not lies, not contradictions that could stand on their own. Just details that didn't line up perfectly. One person remembered the back door being open longer than someone else recalled. Another was unsure whether Annie had been seen playing near the fence or closer to the porch. Times shifted by minutes, sometimes by more. On their own, none of it meant anything. Together, they lingered. Investigators knew how grief worked. Trauma distorts memory. Stress compresses time. They had seen enough families fall apart under scrutiny to approach carefully. Still, the pattern was familiar. In cases like this, the absence of evidence outside the home often pointed inward, whether anyone wanted to admit it or not. The Lehman household had not emerged from the disappearance intact. Grief moved through it unevenly, pulling people in different directions. Some family members clung tightly to one another, united by loss. Others withdrew, retreating into silence that felt safer than conversation. Detectives noticed the strain during follow-up visits, the way answers were shorter now, more guarded. Extended family members, interviewed months later, offered recollections that didn't always match what had been recorded early on. They disagreed about who had arrived at the house and when, about who had been present that afternoon and who hadn't. Again, nothing concrete. Just a growing sense that the timeline was less solid than it once appeared. Outside the home, the town changed its relationship with the Lehman family. At first, there had been overwhelming support. Candlelight vigils, fundraisers, neighbors dropping off food, offering help in any form they could. But as the years passed without answers, sympathy quietly gave way to suspicion. Not overtly, not spoken aloud in public, but it existed in glances held too long, in conversations that stopped when someone entered the room. Rumors moved through the community the way rumors always do, gaining shape without substance. Someone claimed to know something. Someone else insisted the truth had been hidden from the beginning. Each whisper chipped away at trust, leaving the family increasingly isolated. They were no longer just parents who had lost a child. They were a mystery people felt entitled to solve in their own minds. For the parents, life became a cycle of endurance. Annie's birthday came and went each year, marked by silence and a grief that no longer surprised anyone. Holidays carried an extra weight, her absence visible in empty chairs and unopened gifts that no one could bring themselves to discard. Interviews with local media were given carefully, words chosen with precision. They spoke of hope, of unanswered questions, of never giving up. And all the while, they were aware of the unspoken scrutiny behind the cameras. Investigators observed this from a distance. They noted the emotional toll without assigning meaning to it. Grief manifests differently in different people. Some speak constantly. Others shut down. None of it proved anything. What frustrated detectives most were the limitations of the time. The backyard where Annie had last been seen was no longer preserved. It hadn't been treated as a long-term crime scene because no one had expected it to be one. Footprints had been trampled by searchers. Potential trace evidence had been lost to weather and movement. DNA testing, still in its early stages in the mid-1990s, offered little help without physical samples to analyze. Technology that might have provided answers years later simply didn't exist yet. There were no home surveillance cameras, no cell phone location data, no digital trail to follow. Investigators were left with memories, statements, and intuition. And intuition, no matter how informed, could not carry a case on its own. Despite this, certain details refused to fade. The shoes left by the back steps, the intact fence, the abrupt end of the scent trail. Each one returned again and again in internal discussions, never forming a complete picture, but never disappearing either. Privately, detectives debated possibilities they could not articulate publicly. Accidents happen. Panic follows. People make decisions they believe will protect others or themselves in the moment. These conversations were cautious, theoretical. No one wanted to accuse without evidence. No one wanted to cause further harm to a family already living with unimaginable loss. Years continued to pass. Detectives retired or transferred. New investigators inherited the case file, reading it with fresh eyes, but the same limited tools. Each one reached the same impasse. Without new information, there was nowhere to go. Eventually, the case was officially shelved again, not because it was forgotten, but because it could not move forward. It remained open on paper, unresolved, but inactive. In the margins of the file, notes remained, questions unanswered, red flags circled, but never crossed. The case of Annie Lehman settled into a quiet, uneasy place. Not solved, not abandoned, just waiting. And as time stretched on, stretching loyalties and memories along with it, investigators understood something fundamental. If the truth ever surfaced, it would not come from the past. It would come from the present, from someone who had lived with it long enough that silence became heavier than confession. Every case on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. Each episode takes nearly 15 days of research and long nights chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and someone out there still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, please take a second to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support keeps us going. And if you want to watch more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. Time did what the investigation could not. It moved forward steadily and without mercy, carrying people away from the moment Annie Lehman disappeared, while leaving the question itself untouched. Nearly 2 decades passed, and her case slipped into a quiet category known only to law enforcement and families who lived inside it. Open, but inactive. Unsolved, but no longer urgent in the eyes of the system. The town changed. New families moved in. Businesses opened and closed. Children who had been Annie's age in 1995 grew up, left for college, started families of their own. For many, Annie's name became something they vaguely remembered hearing once, a story from another time. For others, especially those who had searched that first night, the memory never fully faded. It just stopped being spoken aloud. Inside law enforcement, the case aged visibly. Original detectives retired or passed away. Handwritten notes yellowed. Cassette tapes sat boxed and unplayed. Leads that had once felt pressing were now frozen in the language of the mid-1990s. The case file survived, but the momentum did not. Within the Lehman family, time did not bring closure. It brought distance. Relationships strained under the weight of what was never said. Grief did not resolve into acceptance. It hardened into silence, resentment, and avoidance. Some family members moved away, unable to stay tethered to a place that held so much unresolved pain. Others stayed, anchored by obligation or guilt they could never quite name. Annie's absence became permanent in a way that no memorial could soften. There were no anniversaries marked publicly anymore. No interviews. No vigils. Just a quiet understanding that whatever answers existed had not been strong enough to survive the years. Then, nearly 19 years after Annie vanished, something shifted. It did not happen suddenly. It began with a broader change inside law enforcement. Cold case units were expanding across the country, fueled by advances that had not existed when Annie disappeared. Records were being digitized. Old evidence was being re-examined. Behavioral analysis had evolved. Investigators were learning to read silence as carefully as statements. Annie Lehman's case was flagged again, not because of a new tip, but because it fit a category cold case teams knew well. A young child, no witnesses, no physical evidence recovered, a disappearance from a controlled environment. Cases like that often didn't stay unsolved forever. They waited. The file was reopened quietly. Not announced, not publicized, just placed back on a desk, this time in front of investigators who had no personal history with the family or the town. They approached it without emotional memory, reading it the way one reads a story whose ending is missing. The first step was organization. Every report, note, and recording was digitized. Timelines were rebuilt with software that allowed investigators to layer statements over one another, highlighting where they overlapped and where they diverged. Patterns emerged that had been harder to see on paper. Not accusations, not conclusions, but areas of tension. Forensic reanalysis was limited. There was still no preserved physical evidence from the backyard. Nothing to test, nothing to compare. Technology could only go so far without material to work with. But behavioral profiling offered another avenue. Investigators revisited the circumstances of Annie's disappearance, not to ask who did it, but how it could have happened. They studied similar cases. Accidental deaths misreported as disappearances. Situations where panic overtook logic. Families who believed they were protecting one another, only to create a tragedy that grew larger with time. With that framework in mind, they began re-interviewing surviving family members. These conversations were different from the ones held 19 years earlier. No one was frantic now. No one was pleading for answers. Everyone involved was older, more tired, and far more careful with their words. Memories had shifted. Some details had sharpened. Others had blurred beyond recovery. Investigators noticed that the confidence once present in early statements was gone. Timelines were less certain. Explanations were qualified with pauses and corrections. Some family members contradicted themselves without realizing it. Others offered new details that had never appeared in earlier interviews, then struggled to explain why. Again, nothing definitive surfaced. No confession, no direct accusation. But something else was present now that hadn't been before. Fatigue. 19 years is a long time to carry silence, long enough for fear to dull, long enough for loyalty to erode, long enough for the weight of an unspoken truth to become heavier than the consequences of speaking it aloud. Investigators sensed it in the way questions landed, in the way answers came more slowly, in the moments where people seemed to drift, as if replaying something they had spent years trying not to remember. Within the family, dynamics had shifted further. People who once protected one another no longer shared the same urgency to maintain that protection. Relationships had fractured. Resentments had grown. The shared narrative that once held the family together was weakening under time's pressure. Investigators didn't push aggressively. They didn't threaten. They didn't accuse. They understood that whatever truth existed here would not be extracted through force. It would surface when someone decided they could no longer live with it. That moment came quietly. There was no dramatic phone call, no sudden revelation splashed across headlines. One family member reached out privately, requesting a meeting. The message was careful, neutral. It did not contain accusations or specifics, just a request to speak in confidence about Annie. When investigators agreed to the meeting, they recognized its significance immediately. In cold cases like this, outreach from within the family rarely came without reason. People don't reopen wounds without a cause. The meeting was scheduled discreetly. No media, no announcements, just a room, a recorder, and a silence that carried nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions. The family member did not arrive angry, or defensive, or emotional in the way people often are when revisiting old trauma. They arrived exhausted, as if the act of asking for the meeting had already taken everything they had left. They did not begin with accusations. They did not name names. They spoke instead about memory, about time, about carrying something for so long that it begins to change shape, pressing in on every part of life. Then, finally, they said they were ready to talk about what really happened. For investigators, that moment was unmistakable, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way they were delivered. This was not speculation. This was not rumor. This was someone stepping out from behind a story that had been protected for years. As the recorder clicked on and the door closed, the silence that had surrounded Annie Lehman's disappearance for 19 years began at last to break. The room where the truth began to surface was unremarkable. Plain walls, a table scarred by years of use, a recorder placed carefully between 2 people who understood without saying it, that whatever came next could not be taken back. 19 years of silence pressed into the space, heavy enough to make even the smallest movement feel deliberate. The confession did not arrive as a single, explosive statement. It came in fragments, pauses stretched longer than sentences. The person speaking did not frame it as guilt or innocence. They framed it as memory, as something that had never stopped replaying, no matter how hard it had been buried. Annie had not been taken by a stranger. There was no passing car, no unknown predator waiting beyond the fence. The truth was smaller than that, and far more devastating. On the afternoon she disappeared, Annie had been exactly where everyone believed she was. The backyard, the familiar space, the place that felt safest. What happened next was not an act of violence. It was an accident. Sudden, brief, the kind that unfolds in seconds and leaves no time to react properly. Details emerged carefully. A lapse in supervision that no one believed would matter. A moment where attention shifted elsewhere. Annie fell. Not far. Not dramatically. But enough. The injury was immediate and irreversible. Panic followed faster than reason could catch up. The person describing it had not intended harm. That was never in question. What followed, however, was shaped by fear. Fear of blame. Fear of prosecution. Fear of losing everything that still remained. Other family members became involved, not because they wanted to commit a crime, but because they believed they were protecting one another from a future they could not face. In that moment, a decision was made. Not after hours of planning. Not with cold calculation. It was made under shock, with hearts racing and thoughts collapsing inward. They believed wrongly that the truth would destroy everyone. They believed silence was survival. Annie's body was concealed on the property, Not far. Close enough that the weight of it never truly left. The disappearance was staged not with sophistication, but with desperation. Shoes left behind. The yard left intact. No signs of struggle, because there had been none. As the confession continued, investigators listened without interruption. They had learned long ago that truth does not need to be forced once it begins to surface. What mattered was corroboration. Memory alone could not close a case. When investigators began reviewing the confession against the old file, details that had once felt meaningless snapped into place. The intact fence, the abrupt end of the scent trail, the absence of any outward movement from the yard. Each piece aligned not with abduction, but with containment. Soil disturbances noted years earlier, but dismissed as inconclusive, were revisited. Structural changes on the property, alterations made shortly after Annie's disappearance, were re-examined with new eyes. What once appeared to be routine repairs now carried context. A warrant was obtained quietly. The excavation that followed was conducted with care, not urgency. This was not a search for suspects. It was a recovery. The ground gave way slowly. Layers of soil peeled back, each one carrying the weight of time. When remains were located, there was no sense of triumph, only confirmation. Forensic analysis verified what the confession had already made clear. Annie had never left the property. She had never been lost to the world. She had been hidden from it. The emotional impact of that realization rippled outward. For investigators, it was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions. For the community, it was a reckoning. Rumors that had once floated without anchor now collapsed under the truth. Suspicion that had poisoned relationships was replaced not with relief, but with a heavier understanding. This had not been evil. It had been fear, and fear had stolen more than just a life. For the family, there was no resolution in the traditional sense. The truth did not bring peace. It brought clarity, and clarity came with its own punishment. Years spent watching neighbors whisper. Years of interviews given under the weight of unspoken guilt. Years of anniversaries marked not just by loss, but by knowledge no one else carried. Annie had not been erased by a stranger. She had been erased by adults who believed they were saving themselves from destruction, only to condemn themselves to a quieter, longer one. Investigators documented everything meticulously. Statements were recorded, evidence logged. The case file, once thin with unanswered questions, grew heavy with finality. But even as the facts solidified, another reality loomed. Time had passed. Statutes of limitation did not bend for grief. Charges were weighed carefully against the law as it existed, not as anyone wished it to be. Prosecutors reviewed the case with an understanding that justice, in its legal form, might never fully align with the truth that had finally surfaced. What could not be undone was the loss. What could not be ignored was the cost of silence. The revelation did not make headlines immediately. It emerged slowly, respectfully. When the public learned the truth, reactions were mixed. Anger, sadness, confusion. Many struggled with the idea that a child could disappear without ever leaving home, that an accident could metastasize into a lifelong lie. For those closest to the case, the weight was crushing not because of shock, but because of the years that could never be returned. Years spent searching fields and waterways, while the answer lay buried beneath routine. Years where Annie's name became synonymous with mystery instead of memory. As the investigation reached its final phase, one truth stood above all others. Annie Lehman had not vanished. She had been lost, and then hidden, in a moment that spiraled beyond control. The secret meant to protect a family had instead consumed it, stretching its consequences across nearly 2 decades. And now, with the truth finally exposed, the question that remained was not what happened to Annie. That had been answered. The question was what justice could possibly look like after so much time had already been taken. Once the truth was documented and the remains were recovered, the case moved into a phase that no one involved had imagined during those first frantic days in 1995. The mystery was no longer about what happened to Annie Lehman. That question had finally been answered. What remained was something far more complicated. What, if anything, could justice look like after 19 years? Prosecutors approached the case with caution and restraint. Every decision was weighed against the law as it existed, not against public emotion or private grief. The confession was reviewed line by line. The circumstances of the accident were analyzed carefully. Intent mattered. Age mattered. Time mattered more than anyone wanted it to. Statutes of limitation became unavoidable obstacles. The initial act had not been a homicide. It had been a tragic accident. The cover-up, while morally devastating, existed in a legal gray space shaped by laws written decades earlier, never anticipating a situation like this one. Some potential charges were no longer viable. Others carried penalties that felt inadequate when measured against the scale of loss. Prosecutors understood the anger this would provoke. They understood that for many, the idea that no one might face prison time would feel like a second injustice layered on top of the first. But the justice system could not retroactively reshape itself to satisfy grief. It could only operate within its limits. When the legal conclusions were made public, reactions split the community once again. Some people felt betrayed, not just by the family involved, but by the system itself. They wanted accountability that felt proportionate to the pain Annie's disappearance had caused. Others felt an unexpected sense of relief. After years of speculation, rumors, and whispered accusations, the truth brought a kind of clarity that no punishment could replace. Annie's name returned to public memory, this time without a question mark attached to it. She was no longer a missing child frozen at 6 years old. She was acknowledged as a victim whose story had an ending, however painful that ending was. A burial was arranged quietly. There were no cameras, no speeches designed for an audience, just a small gathering of people who understood that this moment was not about closure, but about dignity. Annie was laid to rest properly, her name engraved, her existence affirmed in a way that had been denied for nearly 2 decades. Official records were corrected. Missing person databases were updated. Cold case files were closed with annotations that spoke not of mystery, but of resolution. For investigators who had carried the case for years, the administrative finality felt strange. They had spent so long searching for answers that having them suddenly felt almost unreal. Privately, many detectives struggled with what they felt. Satisfaction did not apply. Relief felt inappropriate. There was only a muted sense that the truth, at least, had not been lost forever. Some revisited old notes and reports, recognizing details they had questioned years earlier, but could never prove. Others wondered if anything could have been done differently, knowing that hindsight offers clarity that reality never does. Within the family, the aftermath was uneven and deeply personal. Some relationships dissolved entirely under the weight of the revelation. Others survived, not because forgiveness came easily, but because time had already stripped away so much that there was little left to lose. Grief did not end with the truth. It changed shape, settling into something quieter, but no less heavy. Those who had carried the secret the longest faced a different kind of reckoning. The fear that once drove silence was gone, replaced by an understanding that the cost of concealment had been far greater than the consequences they once imagined. They lived not with the anxiety of being discovered, but with the reality of being known. For the town, the story became something people spoke about carefully, aware now of how easily assumptions can take root and how long they can poison a place. Annie's disappearance had shaped the community in ways no one fully understood at the time. Parents became more watchful. Trust changed. Innocence thinned. And yet, even with the truth laid bare, nothing was restored. Annie did not grow up. Her family did not get those years back. Investigators did not reclaim the nights spent chasing leads that led nowhere. The truth closed the case, but it did not heal the damage left behind. In the end, justice arrived in fragments, in acknowledgement rather than punishment, in record corrections rather than verdicts, in a name spoken clearly instead of whispered uncertainly. Annie Lehman was no longer missing. She was no longer a question. She was recognized, remembered, and mourned as a child whose life ended too soon and whose absence reshaped everyone it touched. The truth came late, heavy, and incomplete, offering no restoration, only recognition. And sometimes, in cases like this, recognition is all that remains.